how do you ensure impartiality and non-discrimination when delivering cash through Amanacard?
Like we never kind of like interfere in the NGO program itself, or like why that like person, like I'm not checking like the timesheet, you know, like why is that getting that money or etc. So we're kind of like implementing like or like facilitating the payments with and on behalf of the NGO on the ground. So it's still kind of like the same, like the fund and the donors, etc. We're not involved in that at all.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, we've got nothing to do with the beneficiary selection. However, we have helped NGOs with where they have been pressured to create lists that might have ghost people on them. So we've kind of, through this more disciplined approach, you know, been able to talk softly to the people that have pressured the local NGOs to put names on lists or create fake camps, etc., and just say, look, you know, this is not going to be acceptable with this new form of digitized aid where everything is visible real time from outside and inside, and there's no, all the manual paperwork that could normally support such bad practices is no longer available. So that's why we really keep reinforcing this idea that only use paperwork where it's absolutely essential.
Do you see any role for Bitcoin? And I guess that you could expand that to look at some of the other cryptocurrencies, blockchain.
I just think that the most basic level, Bitcoin requires something to off-ramp. So you still need something real in the market to give people a sense that when they're picking up their salary, they're actually getting something real. And in every conflict zone I've ever worked in where the local currency is wildly fluctuating, the US dollar is still king. And so US dollars do happen to be in the mix all the time, which means our focal point should really be on the US Treasury at every point. But until Bitcoin sort of offers a more practical, real world solution for these contexts, I'm not sure it's that relevant. I mean, blockchain technology underpinning Bitcoin is something we looked at very early on when we started, and it wasn't as developed as it is today. But effectively, we're operating a similar kind of immutable, cryptographically secure database that's not that different from blockchain. It doesn't have some of the weaknesses that blockchain has, but I know that there's a number of other solutions like that. I think the main thing to emphasize is we're not a technology first company. We are actually, you know, we're combining the best from the aid and the private sector to try and come up with a solution which is much more holistic around the processes that need to be improved internally, the kinds of attitudes one should have towards end recipients, and how one advocates for them to upstream with banks and donors. So what we're trying to do is get it right down to the guts of what is required to confirm. Someone's question was about diversion, that this donation does end up with the intended end recipient. And so we've basically kind of stripped everything right down to, it's essentially an agreement between two people as to what was handed over in that transaction. And the key thing is to know who those two people were. And, you know, there's a lot of mistrust in sharing one's information in a conflict zone because of fear of attack reprisals from the other side or whatever. So then you get a lot of people providing fake IDs to protect themselves, thinking, well, that's, you know, it's just, I've got to show an ID, so I'll just send that. So what I mentioned earlier about building trust, it's very difficult to entrust, you know, to get people to realize that you need their real information so that you can then talk to the banks and the publics that are donating the money through the governments, that we do know who the end recipients are. And there's a very isolated pocket of really at-risk groups here, you know, ones that are supplying sanctioned products or whatever. The bulk of the people, as I said, employed by NGOs, hospitals, schools, these are people providing a service to the people on whatever side, and you know, and they should be able to access that money.
What are your biggest challenges to building on your work today? What kind of support, particularly from donors, would you most like to see?
Well, we originally, thank you for that question. We originally I was an independent expert actually working in a consulting firm, and we actually went to donors about 6 years ago and said, look, this is an issue affecting the whole sector. It's not a good use of donor funds for us to be sort of independently, bilaterally supporting each charity. Why don't you create some kind of sponsor, sort of a pooled due diligence resource, for example, for merchants, so that, you know, the poor merchants, if you're in a context for 10 years, they're going to be continuously asked the same kind of questions, and maybe not in the best way in these environments. So how about you pool, you know, bring the best kind of expertise, the best people in various think tanks that really understand the context, the local people, pool that as a sort of resource, and then people can draw on us. That was one idea, and that wasn't taken up at the time, but I understand there's been developments not specifically related to that, but pooling diligence on charities themselves in the localization agenda. So potentially that could be revived as an idea. Another thing is just to encourage better coordination. So especially where there's consortia, you know, there's big consortia in Syria, which provide great opportunity for collaboration. And yet they sort of, they feel a lot of the time they're consortia in name only, and they're not sort of operationally really that well connected. We could be offering our service at a much greater scale and thus impact if the NGOs in the same consortia decided to share practices and the common platform. They would still have their own permissioned access and things, but just basically, you know, allowing us that economy of scale, because we're still very much working in this one-to-one model. And as I said at the beginning, it's not sustainable for us to be essentially working through the whole chain from the source to the end recipient, dealing with the banks upstream, and then all the way down to helping, you know, this very fine-tuned independent verification at the other end. So if there was some way to better coordinate either among the NGOs or among the donors, because we're all in this together, we're all facing exactly the same challenges. And in order to get more value for money, especially at the moment with the pinch that we're feeling, and some governments like in the UK here, you know, massive slashes to aid budgets, we need to be thinking about doing things differently. We know we can really help in that process, and so I'd encourage donors to involve us. Often we get sort of, you know, people think, oh, you're a company, so therefore you shouldn't really be involved. We're actually a social impact enterprise. We've got it ingrained in our purpose, in our articles. We can't deviate from our social articles, which talk about supporting people in the highest risk and hardest to reach places on the planet. So, you know, we're here to help. So we'd be we'd love to join in some dialogue. Mentioning dialogue, though, dialogue needs action. And we've had so much dialogue around this issue for over 10, 15 years. And my interest in this subject started after 9/11. And that's why we kind of jumped into the pan and started to operate a model, because we just found the dialogue wasn't quite getting us there. But obviously you still need to talk, and that's the first step to cross-sector collaboration.
You talked at the beginning about building trust as the key component to improve the system. Do you see any positive trends towards building trust now? And can you provide some illustrations on this and changes you've observed in the last few years?
I think we've had a really positive experience with us building trust with local NGOs, partners on the ground, and showing them that the things are really possible to do things a bit differently, a bit of tweaking and partnership. I think from the other side of the spectrum, the merchants, I think the trust has only kind of continued to erode since 9/11, really. So Syria is just the most recent example of where informal market actors are maligned because they're seen to be associated with terrorism. And that's only got worse in recent times. With Syria, we've seen, I mentioned this the other day on a webinar, that, you know, some of the main networks of cash agents have now been sanctioned in Syria. And these are sort of household names that, you know, of course there's some evidence behind the sanction, but it sort of opens the question of, well, what does it mean for a small operator that might have, you know, 10 different company brands on his window because he's operating within different networks? Does that mean that we can no longer deal with him? Is he tarred with the same brush as the OFAC sanctioned entities? So I think there is an ever shrinking kind of space of dealing with merchants in Syria, and it does cause, you know, negative practices with people just morphing into different entities rather than actually just fronting up to say, this is the reality of how money actually can move in the absence of banks in these areas. And so let's actually engage openly with these players, explain to them what AML CTF is about. That's what we do. I do it all the time with merchants, really explain to them what sanctions are, what regulations are. It's often the first time that anyone has ever actually explained to them that there's this international system where the sending banks, have restrictions, and intermediary banks have questions that we need to respond to. And so yeah, I think there's positives and negatives on the trust building side. Thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate you coming together today. Thank you, Erica.
Thank you from me as well. Do get in touch if you have any follow-up questions.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks.